Hi, everybody. This is Daniel Karupkin from Thornhill, Ontario, speaking to you for webyeshiva.org. We are studying Rabbi Saadia Gaon's Emunot V'Deot. We call it the first book of Jewish philosophy. Whether that's accurate or not, it's certainly the first book of medieval Jewish philosophy of the genre that we're used to studying when we talk about books like the Kuzari and the Moreh Nevuchim. And Rabbi Saadia Gaon really is in the same cultural milieu, approximately, as these other great thinkers, and is very influenced by the Kalamist type of approach to religion from an intellectual point of view, using the intellect, and that's where we are today. I wanted to mention, I've been mentioning over the last couple of lessons that we talk about different works of people who have treated Reb Saadia Gaon's Emunot V'Deot. Another one that was brought to my attention, and I'm thankful to one of our listeners, is Rav David Cohen, the Nazir's treatment of Reb Saadia Gaon's Emunot V'Deot. This is a work that is, I believe, a 4-volume work. It has comprehensive notes. It incorporates the Torah of Rav Kook because the Nazir was a premier student of Rav Kook. And I hope that we'll be able to make reference to it occasionally over the period of our study together. I'm going to, let's say, label this part of the introduction. Rabbi Saadia has a lengthy introduction to Emunot V'Deot, which, as remember, Harav Kitover in the late 19th century had divided each one of the sections of the introduction and the 10 parts of the Emunot V'Deot into smaller chapters. We are going to be studying the third section of the introduction today. And if I could give it some kind of introductory title, I would say that this is, using fancy words, using philosophical terminology, this is the theology of epistemology. In other words, what we're going to be talking about is trying to understand what God had in mind in giving us the minds that we do possess, the thought processes that we have, and the certain clearly limited ability to process information, and the great effort that we have to put into trying to clarify things that are shrouded in doubt. As we saw in last week's discussion in section 2 of the introduction, it was clear that Reb Saadia Gaon is very concerned about this issue. He points out to us why it is that there are many things that are confusing to people, and that invariably a person has to spend an entire lifetime trying to figure out ideas that are not at face value so apparent and so clear. And he pointed out that there are many pitfalls in life because we misperceive things all the time. And now he's going to say in this section, why is it that God made us with such a limited intellect that we struggle so much in order to find the truth, this elusive truth, many of us not ever obtaining it in a lifetime, and even those that do are limited in their ability to fully understand everything. So I'm going to share my screen with you at this point, and we're going to take a look at our outline. As I say every week, our outline is available in 2 places for if a person would like to download it. It is available in the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevuchim and Emunot V'Deot, and it is also available on webyeshiva.org in the course description of today's discussion. So the first thing that he says is that a person might ask, what was God's point in allowing doubts to creep into the human mind? Why does Hashem make us so susceptible to misunderstanding things and having so many confusing thoughts? The answer is that by virtue of man being a created being, he must initially possess a flawed mind, which can only be perfected over time and with effort. And basically, his answer is, really, it's somewhat of an answer, but it's not a complete answer. If we look at the patterns of nature, we will discover that when God created this world, he created a world that is not perfect. One of its imperfections is that it is a physical world. And I'm sure we'll get more into that discussion. The corporeal nature of our world makes our world subject to imperfection and flaw. But furthermore, every phenomenon in this world requires effort to bring it to a stage of perfection. And therefore the process of intellectual understanding of things is no different from uh, working the field or trying to make something that is initially coarse into something that is refined. Everything in this world requires work and requires refinement to bring it to its intended state of perfection. And the human mind, therefore, is no different. So he says this is true of all creation. The pattern embedded within each created being is that it must undergo a process of perfection which requires multiple steps. Over time, those ideas that are confused within the human mind slowly are refined and perfected until uncertainties disappear and man's thinking evolves to complete understanding without any doubt. We look at all other human endeavors other than intellectual growth, such as working a field. You have to till the soil. You have to plant the seeds. You have to fertilize and water the field. You have to cultivate. And then you have to make sure that the plants are growing properly through proper pruning. And then eventually you can reap what you sow. When you make a building, you have to build the foundation. You have to construct a frame. You have to build walls and bricks and everything involves a lot of work. It's methodical. There's a process. And then at the end, you end up with a structure. And the same thing is true with weaving a garment. Each one of these physical steps requires multiple stages. And if one were to stop the effort mid-task, the task would never be completed. Just speak to someone who hires a contractor who ends up running out of town in the middle of the job, and you know you don't have your house built. The same thing is true with intellectual endeavors. And as we're going to see, Rabbi Sadia's, the point of this section of the introduction is to try to encourage his reader to not give up. Make sure that even though the endeavor is very difficult towards acquiring these ideas, that you persevere, and that even though it may be difficult and it may be daunting, don't give up in the middle of the task. And therefore, he says, cognition is no different. And in order to attain one's intellectual goals, one must toil through various steps of effort in order to arrive at a perfected intellect. For example, a person at the beginning of a process may have 10 doubts or 10 points of confusion. After some time, one of those doubts would be resolved. In other words, I have 10 questions in my mind. And so I begin the process of exploration. I read books, I confer with experts, and I'm able to answer one of those 10 questions that I have. So now I'm only left with 9. Later, over the course of time, I attack the next question that I have, and I've now reduced my questions to 8, and so forth and so on, until at the end of the process, you will be left doubt-free. It's the same thing with anything that is of value in this world. It requires work, it requires a methodology, and it requires patience in order to see it through from beginning to end. And now he says, I want to expand on this example of a person who starts off with 10 doubts. And this is an exercise in medieval logic where he goes through an explanation which is very illustrative. He says, let's say a person is looking for proof of X. It doesn't really matter what X is, but he wants to prove a certain concept. We know that proofs can only be provided through verbal logical arguments. So let us say that a person is listening out for the right words to prove X. He's trying to incline his ear to be attentive to the world around him that is making sounds, and he hopes that through hearing the correct arguments, he'll be able to prove the X question that he has. So it would first be necessary for this person to filter out all the sounds that he hears other than the exact words he needs in order to prove X. However, it's not so easy to go from 0 to 60 automatically. There are different stages. So this requires multiple filters of his listening faculty, since there are many sounds that emanate as one is attentively listening. The first thing a person would need to filter out are the noises that are made by inanimate objects, such as the colliding of two bodies, such as two rocks hitting each other, or through the cleavage of certain bodies, such as the sound of thunder or the collapse of a structure. This filtering process will be when one recognizes that his quest for a proof for X cannot be provided by those sounds. So essentially, all that Rav Saji is saying is it's very simplistic. When I'm trying to listen out for a proof to X, I'm going to hear a lot of sounds. The first thing that I have to eliminate are sounds that are emanating from sources that are not human voices. And so the first thing that I have to eliminate, my first filtering process, is to eliminate all the sounds that come from thunder, from cars outside, from things banging together, and so forth. My second filtration is going to filter out sounds of animate creatures that do not speak, such as the neighing of a horse, the braying of a donkey, or the bellow of the gazelle, realizing that there is no wisdom to be found in those sounds. So I'm filtering out even more sounds. That we don't think in these terms, of course. We don't consciously go through this thinking process. But what Rav Saj is doing is really an exercise in epistemology to show us how our minds actually work. He's saying that this happens subconsciously, automatically, when we're not even thinking of it. When we're trying to listen out for something that will be helpful to us, we're unconsciously or subconsciously filtering out different sounds. So the next filtration will be to filter out human sounds that are not words, such as words such as ah, or when a person sneezes, or groans or grunts. Those are human sounds, right? So that's we're definitely getting closer, but those are not the sounds that are going to help us with the words that we need to prove X. The fourth filtration will be to recognize human enunciation of letters. But when the enunciation of those letters do not provide anything intelligible, they have to be filtered out. So a person may hear a child recite the ABC or the Aleph Beis. And so he knows, oh, I'm listening to actual intelligible sounds that really form letters. But these letters don't form words, and therefore they're not going to help me. His fifth filtration will be to recognize enunciated words that are comprised of multiple letters. But he will realize that words uttered isolated from a sentence, like sky, star, man, etc., provide no meaningful information because they're not in the context of a sentence. His sixth filtration will be to encounter multiple words in phrases, such as a noun and a verb like the shining star or the writing man, or two verbs like ascending and descending. But even then, these phrases are unhelpful in that they do not even provide a complete narrative of anything real transpiring. And so, therefore, he knows that that phrase, a shining star, is not going to help him prove anything. His seventh filtration will be not just to filter out phrases, but to encounter a phrase or a sentence which is actually descriptive of something that is occurring, such as the sun has just risen, or it just rained, and the like. So this is an intelligible sentence. It's describing something that is meaningful, but then I have to filter out these sentences further to see if these sentences will be of help to me in order to prove my quest. So he's going to, one of the first filtration of actual real narrative sentences are, there are three kinds of narrative sentences. Those that are necessary, which means that they describe something which is obviously true. Let's say you hear someone say, gee, this fire is hot. You know, there's a commercial for hotels.com which has this person called Captain Obvious. And what does Captain Obvious do? He tells you things that you already know. And then he says, and you can get a deal on hotels.com, right? That's the whole thing of the commercial, right? So if a person were to say something like, the fire is hot, shkoyach, thank you very much for saying that. It doesn't provide me with any new information. It doesn't provide me with anything contemplative that will help in my quest to prove X. A person may say something that is patently and absurdly untrue. That's called an impossible statement, such as the fire is cool, in which the information is so obviously false and therefore useless in proving anything. But then you have statements which are more like propositions of the things which are possible, such as Reuven is in Babylon. Now, Reuven, the one person that I'm thinking of, could be anywhere. And so to be provided with this new information, which is not obvious, nor is it impossible, is narrowing down those sentences which might be helpful to me in trying to prove X, something which I have not yet been able to prove, but I would like to prove. And that's the seventh filtration. The eighth filtration will be to reject necessary and impossible phrases, and then to verify the possible statements as either being correct or incorrect. If I narrow down all statements that are possible, like Ruvain is in Bavel, or the soup tastes good, or anything else that is not necessarily true or not necessarily untrue, then I have to figure out which one of these sentences is going to lead me towards a path of trying to prove X. That leads us to the ninth filtration. Will be after rejecting the incorrect possible phrases to take those phrases that are correct and use them to demonstrate X, starting either from a necessary premise and proving using methods that I will later discuss that X is true, or starting from an impossible premise and using negative logic to prove that not X must be impossible. Again, these are exercises in logic. I can prove something in one of two ways. I can take a proposition that is definitely correct and say that if proposition A is correct, this proves X. Or I can say I have proposition B, which is clearly impossible. And if that's impossible, then not having X is also impossible. I can either prove things using positive proofs or negative proofs. That's essentially what he's saying. But it's a filtration process. And his 10th filtration will be to take the one proof that is lucid and clear, that provides us the direction to prove X, and to reject all others, dropping them from his mind. Thus, all the noises that he had previously entertained, which were the cause of his doubt and confusion in the first place, are eliminated. And essentially, what Rav Sadia has just done is given us a rudimentary lesson in how the mind works, how the mind filters out certain things until it arrives at truth. And the reason why he's doing this is because he's saying that the human thought process is no different from any other natural phenomenon that requires a process of construction. And part of that construction is to filter out things because so many ideas are constantly bombarding our mind. I think it's quite fascinating. I think it was Aldous Huxley who once said that instead of thinking of the brain or the mind as a gatherer of information, we should think of the mind as a filter to filter out a constant bombardment of different ideas and different sensory stimuli that are constantly coming into the mind. Our mind actually filters those things out and is able to process things as a result of a filtration system, which creates a bottleneck of ideas and allows us to focus on one at a time. This is what the mind does in order to arrive at truth. This is the process which we discussed above, where gradually a person's doubt decreases from 10 to 9 to 8, etc., until only the pure truth remains. Now, he says, if a person were to stop in the middle of this process, say the fourth or fifth filtration step, he would still have reduced some of his doubt, but other doubts would remain. So if, to use this rudimentary example, if a person has already eliminated non-human sounds, so he's gotten up the chain of the filtration process, but he still hasn't been able to discern whether sounds that he hears from a human being's mouth are intelligible statements or not, he's not really going to be able to resolve a proof for X, but he's certainly closer to where he was when he first started. If he were to retain in his mind what he has already eliminated through his previous filtration, he could resume at a later date from where he left off. Otherwise, he would have to start this process all over again. Okay, based on what we've presented, we see why some people remain in error for their entire life. Some people remain in error because they never even began the process, not knowing how to pursue the truth. They simply don't have the knowledge about how to go through this process of filtration, and so they never even get started. It also goes to the point of what Rav Sadia told us last week, that some people don't even know to search for X or to try. They have no interest in trying to prove something that they don't even know is worthy of being proven. And so therefore they don't even begin the process. Others start the process, abort it, and then go back to the beginning. Like we talked about last week, like the person who departs for the city using one road, gets lost, and has to come all the way back where they started and start on a new path, repeating the process all over again from scratch. And this is the type of unproductive life because you don't build upon previous filtrations of thought that you should have done if you were doing this in a methodical way. This is what is meant in scripture. Um, we have a pasuk in Proverbs that states, "Adam to'eh miderech haskel," that a person may err or go astray from the proper path of intellection. Bikahal rifaim yanuach, and therefore, as a result, he will dwell among the dead in a place where he will not share with the righteous, because he has strayed from the path of intellection, of proper intellectual processing. He's not going to live his life to eternity and see the world to come. He will eventually, therefore, just fade away. When people use perfect logic and filtration like the above, people are less prone to disputations. Now, this is a very important statement because now what Reb Saj is going to do is to point out to us that historically, when people's minds were much more in a perfected state, there were fewer disputations, fewer arguments, fewer disagreements between people because people utilize their intellects much more effectively. And he demonstrates this from a statement in the Gemara, which appears in a couple of places, one of them being in Sanhedrin, Misha Rabu Talmidei Shammai v'Hillel, that when there was a proliferation of the students of Shammai and Hillel, this is at the end of the Second Temple period or shortly after the destruction of the temple, when there was a proliferation of the students of Shammai and Hillel, shaloshim shu kol tzorkan, that they had not properly spent time with their teachers to fully receive the principles that they needed in order to arrive at logical, correct conclusions. Rabu machloket b'Yisrael. That's when disagreements began to increase within the Jewish people. What that means is v'nasei Torah kishtei Torot, and then the Torah turned into like two different religions. You had the Academy of Shammai, the Academy of Hillel, and there were so many disputes. And according to the Talmud, how did that happen? It's because earlier in Jewish history, throughout most of the Second Temple period, there were very few disputes. As a matter of fact, there's a Mishnah that appears in a couple of places that says that you could limit the number of disputes to about a dozen different things up until the destruction of the Second Temple. After the Second Temple was destroyed, and there were students who, because of various external factors and perhaps internal factors, we're not sure whether it's a spiritual phenomenon, that of this concept that we have called nitkatnu hadarot, the generations have decreased in their spiritual intensity, and therefore that translates into an inferior intellectual ability to process information correctly, or whether it's due to religious persecution. And when a people is thrust into galut, is thrust into exile and diaspora, it's much harder to be able to properly study and receive a tradition from one's teachers. But regardless of whether it's a spiritual phenomenon or a phenomenon that's based on nature because of exile, the fact of the matter is there were more disputes at the end of the Second Temple and after the destruction of the temple than there were before. This indicates that if the students had only honed their studies properly, there would not have been so many disputes among them. Therefore, and by the way, I'm going to come back to this idea because the Rambam, in his introduction to the Mishnah, cites this very same Gemara. Therefore, let not the impatient fool ascribe his intellectual shortcomings as God's fault. And going back to where we started, the question began with God. Why did you make me this way? Why don't I have, why is it so hard for me to realize the truth, to see the truth? God, would it have been so terrible if you made me a rich man, like Tevye says in Fiddler? Like, why is it that life is so confusing for me? Why couldn't you have endowed me with a stronger and greater intellect? That's not God's fault. Rather, if I can't arrive at truth, it's because of my own foolishness and my own impatience that has caused me to remain in this foolish state, as we have explained. Every person, at least for most people, and it's not clear whether Rabbi Sadia is suggesting that every human being has equal capacity. That doesn't sound right. Doesn't sound like that's what he would suggest. But every person who is in a search for intellectual perfection simply has to apply himself, have patience, go through the rigorous process, and eventually you will arrive at truth. And don't blame God, therefore, for one's own shortcomings in this process. It would be impossible for a person to be endowed with absolute clarity at the first step. And this is a secondary argument that Reb Sadia is making. As an adjunct to everything that he said up until now, that by virtue of being part of a physical, corporeal, natural state of being in this world, it is necessary to go through a process of construction before arriving at something that is perfect and refined. But there's a secondary argument to this, is that if a person were to expect to be endowed with absolute clarity at the very outset, if that were the case, he would no longer be in the category of a created being based on the nature of all creation, and that's impossible. If a person doesn't seek to blame God for his diminished intellect, but still wishes, he says, okay, God, I'm resigned to the fact that I'm a created being. But God, even you, God, you're omnipotent. You can do anything. So why don't you zap me with a complete understanding? Hashem, give me perfect knowledge. This person is also committing an offense. He is essentially asking to be God, since the only being who can know without antecedent causes is God himself. In other words, if you're expecting God to zap you with immediate knowledge without having gone through the preparatory stages, which require a lot of effort, you're expecting God to do something which only God can be, which is a perfect being without any previous causes or effort at being perfect. Only God is perfect without any antecedents. Every other created being requires antecedent causes to bring one to that perfection. Created beings, on the other hand, can only attain perfect knowledge through antecedent causes, namely study and analysis, which demands significant time, as we have explained. Now, I just want to make a note here that I note that the Nazir writes in his commentary to Emunot V'Deot, and that is Reb Sadia seems to be ignoring the phenomenon of prophecy. Now, we understand when we study books like the Kuzari that God has the ability to endow even a person who is not filled with tremendous wisdom with the power of prophecy. If a person is extremely pious and righteous, then he may be gifted by God with this endowment of prophetic knowledge without having gone through this very rigorous process that Rabbi Sadia has been explaining. So why does Rabbi Sadia seem to ignore the phenomenon of prophetic knowledge, that the possibility that a person who has not gone through a rigorous uh, preparation can be endowed with knowledge ipso facto from God? Now, the answer might be is that Rabbi Sadia is in accord with the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim as to what prophecy really is. The Rambam, if you'll recall, when we learned about the principle of prophecy in the second section of the guide, the Rambam had said that prophecy is really the result of intellectual perfection. And therefore, for the Rambam, not everyone is going to be privy to prophecy. Only those people who have applied themselves and gone through a rigorous process of intellectual perfection. And then the ultimate level of intellectual perfection is to connect with the emanations that come from the heavens that connect you with divine knowledge, a process which the Rambam had called the active intellect. And therefore, you become endowed because of the rigorous effort that you would put in beforehand. Well, I just want to point out that we haven't yet seen absolute proof yet where Rabbi Sadia falls on the issue of prophecy, but it's something worth noting, at least in this very beginning stage of Emunot V'Deot. But in the interim, during that period of intellectual pursuit, a person perforce must remain shrouded in doubts, because that's the nature of any created being, is that without the prerequisite effort put in to prepare for that perfection, you will never arrive at perfection. And then he concludes this discussion by saying, the most praiseworthy are those who patiently wait through this process until they purify the silver from the dross, the butter from the whey, and those who wait until the plant grows from the seed and the fruit is properly ripened and ready for eating. Notice he's used four different metaphors. He's saying that the whole process of arriving at truth is like a filtration, like pulling out silver from dross, pulling out butter from whey, basically extracting the butter fat from the rest of the milk. And it's also like being patient, not just a filtration, but it requires patience to wait. That after you plant a seed, you have to wait for it to grow. And after you have a tree, you have to wait for the tree to bear fruit and for the fruit to ripen before harvesting it. Otherwise, it won't be edible. Now, the Rebbe Sadia cites four different verses, three of them from Mishlei, from Proverbs, and one from the book of Hosea, to say that these are not random or arbitrary metaphors. These are metaphors that are actually mentioned in the scriptures. So, for example, in Proverbs chapter 25, it says, Hago sigim mikasef, extract the dross from the silver, vayetze latzarev keli, and only in that way will the artisan be able to manufacture the silver vessel. And in Proverbs chapter 30, it talks about the extraction of the whey in order to be able to produce butter. And in the book of Hosea, it says that you need to plant for righteousness and to be able to harvest according to that endeavor. And again in Mishlei, in chapter 3, it says the famous verse that we say in our prayers, Eitz Chaim hi lama chazikim ba. The Torah is compared to a tree of life. And therefore, if I want to be able to reap the sweet pieces of information from the Torah, I have to wait until everything has ripened in my own mind. And I just wanted to point out, this is my own commentary, that it seems that Rav Sadia chooses to use four deliberate metaphors that are in ascending order of subtlety. The first analogy is that you have to extract the silver from the dross, because dross has no use whatsoever. So therefore, the first thing you need to filter out from your minds are things that are absolutely rejected and have no use to be in your mind. But the second process of filtration is to filter out those things which may have utility but do not help in finding the true quest for truth in life and connection to God. Because when you separate whey from curds or whey from butter, ultimately whey has use. You can use whey. Whey is a fantastic fertilizer. You can use it as it has health benefits if you extract whey. So it's not something that has to be discarded like dross, but it does have utility. But even then, you have to filter out the great from the good. And the third level of subtle processing within the mind that has to take place is that you need to have patience. There is no filtration here. You're not rejecting anything, but you have to wait until the seed germinates and then the seed sprouts and grows, just like the cultivation of rudimentary knowledge into something more sophisticated. And finally, the most subtle method of intellectual perfection is harvesting fruit only when it's ripe. And that is to say, I recognize that I have a kernel of knowledge that is absolutely true and necessary, but allowing even correct and sophisticated ideas, though they need to ferment in one's mind until they're ready for harvest and for utility and to be able to use them and apply them to one's life. So that's the conclusion of our third part of the introduction. And then the fourth part of the introduction is where Rabbi Sadia Gaon is going to launch to a discussion of emunah, of what faith in God is, why it is necessary, and how it has to do with this work called Emunot V'Deot. So far, he's talked about the Deot part, the human mind and how the mind thinks, the epistemology of Judaism, and now he's going to talk about the Emunot part in the next section. But before I leave you for today, I just wanted to point out that the Rambam, first of all, the Rambam was a great admirer of Rebbe Sadia. He does disagree with him in certain areas in the guide, but at the same time holds him in great esteem. In the Rambam's introduction to the Mishnah, which is a very, very extensive piece of work. It's considered to be required reading for anyone who wants to understand the philosophy of Mishnah and the history of Mishnah. The Rambam at some point starts to talk about how is it that we find machlokes in the Mishnah. If the Mishnah is a what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh, it represents the tradition that we received from Sinai. How is it that we find disputes, we find disagreements if everything comes to us as a tradition from Moses? And the Rambam's answer is essentially that the machlokot, the disputes that we find in the Mishnah, is not part of the tradition that we received at Sinai. We received at Sinai a pristine unitary tradition of law. But over the course of time, as people's thinking processes began to deteriorate because of this long chain of transmission, and invariably things deteriorate the longer the chain of transmission is, there were certain ideas that either were forgotten or that were never brought up in the original discussion that needed to be hashed out. And that's how machlokot began. And I'm just coming in the middle of this discussion, and therefore we're just going to read it from I got this translation from Sefaria, thanks to Rabbi Francis Nataf, I believe is the translator, and he writes as follows: the matter of that which they said from when the students of Shammai and Hillel, who did not serve all that was required of them, multiplied, disagreement grew in Israel. So this statement is evident in that when two people are of equal intellect and investigation and knowledge of the fundamentals from which reasonings extrapolate, no disagreement will occur in their reasonings in any way. And if it does occur, it will be minimal, as it is only found that Shammai and Hillel, them as individuals, disagreed very seldomly about isolated laws. That is because the thoughts of the two of them were very close, one to the other, in everything that they extrapolated by way of reasoning. Because they were so refined in their thinking process, they found themselves disagreeing on very, very few things, because the more refined one's thinking is, the more attuned it is to absolute truth. And likewise, the fundamentals that were given to this one were like the fundamentals given to that one, meaning the hermeneutic principles and the ways that you arrive at truth were very much the same traditions. Shammai and Hillel were aligned in this area. But when the diligence of the students towards wisdom slackened and their reasoning weakened in comparison to the reasoning of Hillel and Shammai, disagreement occurred among them in the investigation of many things, as the reasoning of each and every one of them was according to his intellect and to what he had in hand of the fundamentals. So basically, not only was the thinking process diminished by the time we get to Hillel and Shammai, but there was a maculation of the foundational principles of how to arrive at truth, the sort of the keys that you need in order to logically arrive at truth through this filtration process that he's discussed, that also became compromised. And therefore, the students who did not properly learn everything that they should have learned from their teachers were prone to different ways of thinking and arriving at different conclusions. Nonetheless, they should not be blamed, as we cannot force two sages that debate in investigation to debate according to the intellect of Yehoshua and Pinchas. Essentially, what he's saying is, you can't expect the rabbis of today's generation to have the same level of perfect thought as the rabbis of 1,000 years or 2,000 or 3,000 years ago had. And likewise, we have no doubt about that which they debated, just because they are not like Shammai and Hillel or like those before them. In other words, we do accept the legitimacy of the debate, and we say many times, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. Both of them possess some aspect of truth, but because they are not aligned in exactly the proper way of thought, there are going to be different deviations. As the Holy One, blessed is He, did not command His service in this manner. He doesn't want us to only follow the older sages. He wants us to follow the contemporary sages as well. He commanded us to listen to the sages of our generation, as it is stated to the judge that will be in those days. The famous teaching from the Midrash is that you only have the judges of your own days. You cannot hearken back and say, I'm only going to listen to the rabbis of yesteryear and will not listen to the rabbis of today. You have to accept that the rabbis that God gives you today, even though they may not be as perfect in their thought, even though they may have some serious flaws in their character and in their thinking process, the fact that you are living today means that you have to accept the teachers that you have today. And it is through these ways that disagreement occurred, not because they erred in the laws and one is saying truth and the other is saying falsehood, but rather because there are certain flaws in the transmission process, and we simply don't know which direction to go in those ambiguous areas. And how evident is this matter to all that give cognizance to it, and how precious and great is the fundamental principle about the commandments. So this is just a snippet from the Rambam's introduction to the Mishnah. I just ponder as to whether the Rambam pulled this out of Rabbi Saadia Gaon's Emunot V'Deot, as he was well versed in this sefer. So this is where we're going to hold it for today, and we're going to hopefully be able to resume the next part of the introduction, section number 4 of the introduction, which is all about the Emunot of Emunot V'Deot. Questions or comments before we recess for the day? Yes, I see someone has his hand raised. Please just unmute yourself, Yehuda.
I have sort of a two-pronged question here regarding the statement of the only path to clear understanding is through verbal logic arguments. I find this a little odd for somebody who is a Reish Masifta, and they used other methods of proof, such as psukim, for example. And
I'm
given
sorry,
that,
such as what?
such as quoting psukim. How
Okay.
does the Gemara bring us rayos? Not through simple verbal logic. So, although it does exist.
Yes, I would just I would think that what Rabbi Saadia is saying is that to arrive at truth, one has to know how to properly extract logical information from those psukim, from those verses. So it's not that he's in any way disputing the authority and the authenticity of that which is commanded to us in Tanakh, but rather he is saying that if you wish to arrive at truth, whether it's halachic truth, whether it's logical truth about existence, you're still going to have to use a process of filtration in order to arrive at that truth. Okay.
Fair.
All right. Anyone else? But thank you for the question. Okay, I think we'll hold it for today. Let me wish you all a wonderful week. Bezrat Hashem, we should be back next week, and we'll see you all then. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.